I'm delighted to speak with Ido Feder, who holds degrees in philosophy from Tel Aviv University and is an independent choreographer and artistic director based in Tel Aviv. Ido's interests include extended choreography, performative curatorship, and contemporary rituals in the art world. Ido studied dance in Code Arts, a dance academy in Rotterdam, and has danced with several eminent choreographers in the Netherlands. He later joined the choreography formation Exers, which is ex.e.r.ce, at the Centre Chorégraphique National in Montpellier, a program for young choreographers, then led by French choreographer Mathilde Monnier, where he worked with many artists. He has choreographed extensively and has presented in all major venues in Israel, Portugal, Spain, France, Belgium, and in many other countries internationally. He is the artistic director of the Diver Festival, an international dance festival in Tel Aviv, known for his conceptual curation and varied programs. Feder is the founder and curator of Tides, Dance and Thought, which is an entity that includes a dance residency program in Jaffa, a research project addressing dance and philosophy, a school for dancer, and an annual conference. Currently, he works on his dance piece Dynasty, which depicts a mythical becoming of company of family of two young boyish gay dancers and a local mature female performance artist. Made for theater space, the work invites the audience to fall deeply into a dream state of the black box, where grief work can take place. Ido, welcome to our two question series, and thanks so much for joining us today. And here are my two questions. Can performance be conserved? If so, how? And if not, why not? And what does it mean to conserve performance?
So thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this very challenging project. I must say, since you invited me, these questions kind of haunted me. And I think it made me feel okay after a while, this haunting, because I thought, okay, that means I'm a performance artist, because I think this, before I answer yes or no, this paradox, one should say, of conserving performance is kind of like a constitutive paradox for people who are busy with performance. And of course, what is it to be busy with performance is what do we mean by that? It's a big question. Everybody who presents performative work is busy with performance? And well, that's a question, but I hope I will put some light on that. So I think after I thought about it a lot, and of course I can answer yes and no, but I decided to go with a no. I think performance cannot be truly conserved, but because this paradoxical endeavor is also very constitutive, like we see in the theory of performance. I mean, the question of how performance stays being documented and how it is ontologically affecting the object, the reception of the work, etc., is from the first days a very big question. So, but why did I say no? So I think it cannot be conserved. Of course, I mean, we have also classical answers for that, but I'm, let's say, if I'm following theorists like Rebecca Schneider, I do think performance remains. So, and so why still it cannot be conserved? Well, I think, well, if you look at performance, not just as a, let's say, putting on a dance work, or not just looking at it from, let's say, the 20th century art world history, I think performance is a kind of a loyalty, one might say even a fidelity to a certain logic, which you can describe that it's, of course, it's a result of the, let's say, philosophy of language and all its developments in the in the 60s. But I think in that fidelity, I mean, I can connect it, for example, to, let's say, Walter Benjamin's kind of heritage of, like, you know, we are left with this aestheticization of the political, or politicization of the aesthetic, you know, being left with this kind of choice and this kind of Second World War prophecy for where late capitalism is going to take us. And I think people who stay with this kind of task, with this kind of loyalty, are kind of going against the desire to be conserved. I mean, of course, there's other things entailed in that. So, for example, like, and if I take it, like, I drop it into this kind of phenomenological area, I always say to my dancers, because we worked a lot in museum spaces, our prerogative here is that we can enter the museum, but we can also exit. So in that way, I mean, we cannot be conserved. But I do think this desire to conserve performance, which is, let's say, a contemporary question, or this desire to get a hold of the immaterial, is very, as I said, it's constitutive for performance, to think about how it retains, how it maintains the work, how do we instill knowledge. But it also reveals, I think, something about contemporary culture. So in that sense, by the fact that I'm saying no, performance can be conserved, doesn't mean that we shouldn't attempt it necessarily. But again, what does it mean to attempt it? Is it always a means of some form of a Trojan horse? So is it always some form of parasitical thought, or you know, almost, let's say, like this kind of Al-Qaeda spreading of invisible cells that are operating individually but are staying loyal to a really different conception of what art is and what art is within culture. You know, of course, we can. I think it's also funny. Like, if you look at conserving performance, even in this kind of like let's say a contemporary etymological travel, conservation pulls us towards conservatism, and performance as this kind of like, you know, basic concept of progressive thinking, let's say. So it's almost like this meeting of this aporia that is growing bigger and bigger in our culture between those two opposing poles. You know, you can say choice versus life, or you can say left and right, or you know. So after this kind of long attempt of deconstructing those binaries, I think conserving performance is showing us already that we're in a different status. We're not only in like the realms of language, and it's not just like a fun escapade for our thought. You know, it's really a changing of our culture. So, you know, the parasitic logic already changed the conservator's room in Tate Modern. It already did something there. It already maybe just opened up the performative component of art, which was always there. It was there when we were painting the caves, and it was there when we were painting the Vatican. We didn't need Austin in the 60s to know that there was a performative aspect. But since the 60s, and since those developments, this reiteration of performance as something that we need to be loyal to insist on, to reinterpret culture, because we are maybe losing it. So I would maybe claim that you cannot conserve performance because it's already an act of conservation. It's an act of conserving, the spirit of humanity, especially in this post-humanist world, you know, especially when we all can smell extinction right around the corner, or we maybe for the first time in history are conceptually or epistemologically able to think of our ontological demise, of our inability to conserve. So yeah, it's I think it's like a task we take with us. If you are, yeah, a performance artist, you are maybe haunted by this question.
I would like to follow up on one issue that you mentioned. Performance cannot be conserved because it is actually already been conserved, which is brilliant. I wonder what kind of performance conservation do you address? That means, what does it mean, right? In other words, to conserve performance for you?
So again, I'm not referring to the mere object of conservation. Of course, if I do a small prefix, I mean, I come from dance, and the idea of dance notation, for example, and its meaning and the insertion of video into the field, of course. So all these things are always there. So I think it was always an issue, even in the early days, how to notate dance or how to pass it forward, and all those questions between oral history and documented history. And so, but again, conservation as a means, which its model is the material world, and preserving almost, yeah, I mean, if you think of a conserved statue, it supposedly, defies time. But even if we think of the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, it's standing there, it's conserved, but its performative element is not conserved. If you think of the Mona Lisa, how it was viewed, I don't know, 100 years ago, it's part of the performative aspect of the work. So, but when I say, what does performance conserve? It conserves exactly that. It conserves the matrix of meaning where the artistic act operates in, and in fact, this matrix is always, to some extent, I think, is always, I don't know if it's necessarily in revolt or if it's always antagonistic, but to some extent it's antagonistic to culture. It's because culture is making things passive. It accumulates. It registers them, and performance is exactly where different contracts appear. But when they appear, to some extent, they register previous contracts and previous deviations from the contracts and possible futures and prophecies, and they always appear with them. So in that sense, I think if I think of good performance works, and again, performance work could be a visual artwork, it could be a dance work, it could be a theory, but with this fidelity to this reiteration of what the performative does, let's say since the 60s and in its development, I think those works to some extent think of their conservation, or they think of what they are conserving in time, or again, what remains and how, and how this thing remains because the performance itself is, like Peggy Faden says, I don't know, is always at loss, or it's something is, so the fact that it's intangible, that it's immaterial, pertains to how it actually conserves, and so in that sense, I think it's more like knowledge, it's more like theory, it's more like spirit. I do think performance, it's a bit of a big claim, I'm going to say that, but I do think performance is kind of like, well, I don't know if it's the lost sister or the inverted mirror of Marxism in a way. I mean, if Marxism was like historical materialism, I think performance is a bit like, well, I don't know if historical, but maybe theoretical spiritualism in a way, because it assumes that in practice and between human interaction and between human objects and contexts, we are working something, we are loyal to something, we are seeing humanity in front of our eyes in a way. And to me, yeah, if I'm being romantic, I think performance is about conserving humanity in a way and conserving the human spirit, especially as it grew in late capitalism, like Rebecca Schneider says, it's because we're already to some extent between the living and the dead, because we're already of what happened to us in the last 100 years. And of course, in these days, we are all kind of like looking at the abyss of what might happen to us in the next 100 years. So what do we want to go into the future with? I think it's a big question that performance is asking. And I think it's asking it exactly by being like falling into the present in a way that cannot be conserved. And also, if we do conserve it, I mean, there's all these enterprises of like in the dance world of like they're choosing pieces to conserve. Now, I'm always thinking about what is this choice, of creating all those canons, and which is yeah, I don't know. I mean, feminist theory, for example, was obsessed with this canon question, or post-colonial theories, So why are we in such a rush to create another canon? And why are we not happy with writing, documenting, registering, theorizing, like doing all this immaterial work, which is not conservation, which is preservation, or which is recreation?
How is writing and documenting not conservation, you think? Because you're drawing the really interesting differences between conservation and preservation, which are implied, but I would love to hear more about this from you.
I'm talking in kind of, in purpose, I'm talking in, let's say, not radical, but let's say pulling the definitions towards their limits. Because of course we can say, I don't know, we can queer it up and think of conservation as a kind of this, basically a recreation, and to think of the art being proposed again and again and again and again within the, and I accept that, as I said before, I accept that as a kind of pervasive parasitic logic, with a real intent to change the conservation room, to change what it means to be a museum, to change what it means to accumulate culture. But again, if you think radically about what this change is, it wants to deny, to some extent, our attachment to the material. It wants to change us as a culture. So I'm always scared a bit of those kind of co-opting loops that usually the meta structure wins. And I think performance is part of the fidelity is to never really go in. I will give you a completely different example, because I think this question is maybe also connected to institutions, or to institutionalization. Like we had this big discussion with different groups in Tel Aviv, whether we should change and in different funding areas to ask for performance to be a specific thing to be funded versus theater, dance, and I was very against it, because I was thinking that at the end of the day, it will lead to less money also in a kind of a pragmatic way, but also kind of it will diminish the possibility of a dance maker to be loyal to the performative logic. If we immediately institutionalize it and measure it according to its material components, aka its aesthetic, aka its transmittive or its affective, discernible components, we might lose the more radical fidelity, which is in a way is a bit transgressive, which in a way is always kind of keeping the ability to stay out, to step out, to go out, to go in and out with memory, with and with a it's halting at the door. You know, if I cite Marina's Abramovich and Ulai's famous piece of like standing at the door of the, you know, it's like, yeah, of course you can recreate that, but this idea of being at the door of things, being able to go in and out, is the conservation of this is not dependent on any material happening. You know, it's not even on its reenactment. It's in that sense, yeah, in that sense, it's exactly like Walter Benjamin said. It's a politicization of the aesthetic, which can be explored and alive and conserved, like thinking is, you know, and like which is exactly what we might not have if we fall into a populist world, or if everything is just an object to consume. So again, I separate documenting and registering from this because, yeah, I mean, like in any knowledge production, we document, we register, we, you know, we know even, and it's not even connected to performance, we collect all what we can on Leonardo da Vinci's, you know, thinking and practices and ta-ta-ta-ta-ta. But it doesn't mean we need to present an object in the end. It doesn't mean, yeah, performance doesn't want to be presented as an object in the end. It's part of its ontology. It's loyal to the event. Yeah, that's exactly revealing, I think, how lawless in a way performance is, because yeah, it's immediately revealing the ideological entanglement that cannot be conserved, not even within time. And I think I will even say it further. I think, like, actually Marina Abramovich is a really maybe the canonical example for that, but I think performance also conserves in a way the logic of conservation, and let's say as that we as humans accumulate and or have ownership of things, and okay, that's one thing that it reveals, and so we can perform that, we can execute that. But I do think we kind of changed, as I mean the subject has changed, you know, even if you think of the thingliness of mediation now, and how, yeah, it's not how we live in a world where of images, and how everything is kind of like it never stops in a way, the performance. It's so conserving it, what does it really mean? It's in a way kind of reenacted all the time. That was also kind of like the genius and the disgust or the crazy of Marina Abramovich, in a way that I almost think that she kind of understood that. So she kind of like she's kind of like performing the soul of capitalism in a way, you know, in a way, like she's constantly embodying a certain yeah, what does one need to do to still perform a sense of being within capitalism, even if it turns you into the being of capitalism, you know, which is maybe what she's like doing in her kind of like institutionalizing, you know, in a way, if you conserve performance, you just do what Marina Abramovich did, and she's the only one who did it, you know. So if performance becomes an object, it kind of becomes that kind of object, you know, where it's like, it's almost like she has the authority of what it is to just be. And it's mediated through images, through practices, through institutions, through museums. It's like she's like a reminder, like she's conserving something, she's holding on to something that maybe culture will not have. Of course, by doing that, she depletes the world of it as well, or she contributes, or she collaborates, or that's exactly where those logics start to kind of you know, become contradictions. But again, I do think conservation of performance is constituting performance. Like
there is a spectrum of theorization about performance. So on the one side of the spectrum, there is this kind of eventual understanding of performance. On the other is perhaps an understanding of performance which is more world encompassing, meaning that the object together with the event constitutes performance, no? And the documentation and the oral histories and everything that is kind of done around performance. Would this be something to discuss, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's you kind of fine line the theoretical polemic of it in a way. I'm not invoking Phelan to kind of preach again this kind of irreducible eventual component of performance. Actually, I do think performance can be just an object or can be, but I do think for me it's more like a Rebecca Schneider kind of argument that if we are actually Phelanists, we are more Phelanists than Phelanists, then actually we see that performance remains. But again, I think there's still this kind of like ontological component of this flip between the material and the immaterial, which is exactly like, you know, it's exactly what makes it a time-based art, this flip, you know? So it's even, let's say, like Badiou said about dance, you know, dance is like the metaphor for thought, because it's exactly, you know, if you think about thought as dance, it's exactly this tension between, you know, the movement, the time that it takes to think, or that it takes to leap from the material to the immaterial, or vice versa. So yeah, in that sense, I agree. I don't think the metrics of performance is this kind of ideology when the event becomes ideology. Having said that, it still has a irreducible eventual component. Yeah, but I think if I take it, yeah. So I wanted to, like, let's say, give a completely like different example from, because I curate a festival, and back to this, let's say, question of documenting and stuff like that. Like, so the festival is once a year, you know, it's an entity that exists. It's a performative entity that exists from the dawn of time, and it's a way to is it a way to conserve performance? So I think my problem with thinking of conservation always through the facet of multiplicity, or always from the facet of potentiality, or that it actually starts to let's say to hide things, or to mask things, like, because I think curation is a different form of care than conservation. It's not the same form of care. So maybe what performance does in the conservation room, that it makes people be curators much more than they are conservators. I don't know, it could be one thesis to propose. But what happened to me with the pandemic, and I think I always thought of my festival, or of my curation, as this kind of performative curation, in the sense that I wanted to make people understand that this festival is trying to create a context actively, like by intervening in culture, but at the same time it wants to talk about history of art, and to kind of like, so it was very I always had that tone, and also because I'm an artist, so it was always, I always kind of did this weird movement between my work and the festival, and between creating also like a generational understanding, and like, who are those groups, who are those people making art now, and how are they talking with the people so all these things were very performative in the festival. And then when the pandemic hit, I just collected a group of people, and we started working in Zoom, and you know, so and my goal was that there's gonna be a festival. That was my goal. The practice, the performance of making a festival will be conserved. And of course it was facing an impossibility, because it was impossible to do dance festivals. How can you do a dance festival without congregating, without coming together? And of course, what everybody did around the world is that said, okay, there's a show today, open your Zoom, please, at 7 o'clock. And let's say we film a stage so they were kind of like simulating the performance. Were they conserving it? Maybe under conservation terminology, they were conserving it. They were conserving the theater, they're conserving putting a piece inside of it. But was it conserving the performance or what it is to do a festival? Does it mean now in this group of people when the world is falling apart, when suddenly there is a division between art and culture? Suddenly art is not in culture because culture has halted. So art can go around and do what it wants, and it can. So how the festival is this archaic entity, which I participate in, conserves at real time this notion of festival. So what we basically did throughout the year, and of course there's like all these contingent weird things, like that in Israel it was allowed to be a group if you were making digital content. It was allowed then to perform together because it was making digital content for other people to consume. So we had this weird allowance to walk around, and what we did, we moved between various cultures, institutions which were closed, and we did this path for this company of bandits, of artists and dancers to go together and move between a closed art museum, between a closed natural history museum, between a closed greenhouse, between a closed planetarium. And we did all these different things in those things, and we recorded, basically we did a documentation of this year of creating a festival, which we do every year, right? We every year do a festival. So the object itself was at the end this online exhibition, a bit like a Netflix series with 5 chapters, 5 episodes, which told the story, which we call the mythos of company, which told so the festival became a mythos, right? What is a mythos? It's always presenting a certain impossibility which you overcome, which you nevertheless perform, So how can a dance festival exist when it's impossible to make dance festivals? Suddenly it becomes this performative video exhibition, but it's still conserved the practice, the performance of a festival more than, just projecting dance pieces on stage. And again, that's what I started my answer with also from the beginning, that conservation performance is this kind of like constitutive paradox for performance makers. You're always clouded or haunted with this question. And sometimes, once in a blue moon, when a pandemic starts, it's like a miracle. It's like a mythos. Suddenly, a festival can be conserved.
Could I come back to something you said earlier, because it really interests me. You said earlier that works think of their conservation, what remains and how. Could you give an example and elaborate a little bit more on this?
Yeah, for example, what I think what I said now about the festival is an example of that. I mean, I didn't have a master plan immediately. It was kind of revealed itself as we were going along. But even if I think, I can think of various examples, but I will give you an example of a piece that was presented in Diver Festival, but in 2021, which I worked then with a performance artist called Hanna. And it was a part of a very complicated project where because it was a year after the pandemic, and so we decided the whole festival is about like, how are we going to meet the audience again after this fasting? So again, this is another thing. How do we conserve this once in a lifetime phenomenon where the audience was, I mean, in 2020, we called it the audience was the company itself, but so after we were kind of encapsulated, after the festival became an object closed in itself, how does it open again? How does it allow audience or this real-time audience? So we were preparing for that for a year, and we were working with this kind of preparation, or how do we create a ceremony for that? And what Anna did is that she wrote a play that is to be read out loud in a group, where you had also 3 performers reading it with you. So each replica or each line in the play had a sign of a heart, which means you have to read it just in your heart, or you read it out loud. And the more the play goes, it kind of like involves also kind of the elements, and it's a very specific theatrical kind of magic or apparatus that it has. But I think it's a good example of how it thinks of how performance is thinking about being conserved. Because on the one hand, it's a play, and this play works wherever. I mean, but at the same time, when we created it, for example, those 3 characters there are, 2 of them at least are one of the real people who were with us in the residency. And so it also kind of puts inside, let's say, something that can never be conserved. I mean, unless all those 2 girls will perform this until the end of time. But I think it proposes already within it the mediation of time, of what can be passed on and what cannot be passed on. And the whole idea of the play is actually about listening and about like you open to the nature and you see around you, you become a community. Everybody's participating, but everybody's also inside themselves. I mean, she wrote it after the pandemic, after we experienced this great alienation and social distancing. So it was really like a ceremony of like being inside yourself, being outside, but still being a community. So it's very clear when you experience this performance that what is completely dependent on the now, but at the same time, it's registered somehow in the play. So it can be passed on. It can be, so it's just an example of a piece that is thinking of what can be passed on, what can be conserved. And of course, like you said, it's an object, it's a book at the end of the day, but it's a book that if you open it, it becomes a theater piece. It becomes a memory of a very specific time in culture. It becomes but I can also think of more simple examples. I think, for example, I mean, when I make, my art practice can be curation, can be creating exactly or imagining exactly these kind of situations where we, or processes. The more I work, the more I understand that I create ceremonies for the present. And of course, that's also a result of being very young and starting to do a festival and doing a year after a year a festival. So that kind of, you are kind of constituted as such. You become somebody that once a year does something, does a ceremony. But that also, I think, kind of influenced my theater work. Or when I do a piece for the theater, it's always some form of ceremony like that. So even when I do, let's say, a conventional dance piece, if I stay with the fidelity to the performative, and then how do I think of what is in it that can be conserved? I think it's of course you can learn the movements, you can learn, but there is something in it that is, like I said, it's a ceremony for the now. It's a ceremony. So for example, my last piece is really created for a specific theater in Tel Aviv, which is kind of the only black box we have because we have really shitty theaters in Tel Aviv. And it's a place, you always go to when you're kind of like, it's so dominant in its aesthetic already that it kind of overtakes everything that is being performed in it, because it's so strong in everybody's cultural memory and everybody's like, you go there and you cannot disconnect from the place. So a lot of artists already don't like to perform there already. But I did a piece specifically for that space, that you go into all between different spaces there, and you kind of like, you go in and you're almost thrown out at the end. There's like and you pass through all the spaces. So it was almost like, and usually I like to perform it that it's in daytime. So you have a feeling that you go into the black box and you're kind of spat out into the daytime afterwards. So it's almost like, for me, it was after doing all those projects with the festival, I wanted to go back to theater. And what is it to go back to this black box now? So it's kind of like a site-specific work only for people who know this theater in a way. Of course, I can change this piece and perform it elsewhere and kind of use different logics of it, but there is something about it that it conserves a certain attitude towards a space, towards and also with this notion of like, after the pandemic, I'm going back to that space because I have nowhere else to go, in a way. And that's also what is being a theater maker. So I invite everybody to go into that space, but feel it a bit differently and to kind of interfere with that. But in a way, there's a level of this piece you can only experience if you are part of this community that goes to this theater. So, and the piece is working also with that logic. So yeah, so that's what I mean by different ways to, that people who are busy with performance are thinking of all those levels of communication that exist within their work. And I think if it's a big question, if the audience, I think once the audience is more and more educated, it can be if they come from conceptual art, minimal visual art, or if they come from postmodern dance. But I think the more people come from, so I think performance becomes also a place for the, like, let's say after the interdisciplinary revolution. So it's more of a transdisciplinary space for people to kind of convene in, you know. So it doesn't really matter if it's in the museum or in the dance festival, but it's for people who are kind of it's kind of like the closest thing we have to an happening, you know. It's like each artwork is somewhat trying to invoking something of that spirit, you know, of that chaos, or of that prayer. I don't know.
So Ido, I'm interested in your view on the audience participation in this conservation question, what kind of role you think audience plays in sustaining, conserving, preserving performance?
Yeah, since the pandemic, I was busy with the loss of the audience, and that's, I called it the mythos of company. And I mean, in Hebrew, we have a really better word, that it's like a palindrome, because if you say the other word around, if you say the word company, lahaka, the other way around, it gives the audience, which is a really kind of crazy mystical thing. I mean, the Hebrew language has all these very, very tasty things with consonants and stuff like that. It's a bit, it's always it's a different etymological travel than in Latin languages, but so yeah, so you know, so it was kind of like, for me, holding the idea of audience within the company. But if I take it, and then we developed, like I told you, to this kind of the arrival of the audience. And then in the third year, in 2022, we did what I called big company exhibitions. We did exhibitions that were, again, investigating different signatures and different objects and how to present different artists together, let's say in the form of an exhibition. But the exhibition that it's not this kind of like democratic facade of, you know, different people under an umbrella. That, so how can it be really performed with this big company notion, that things, and we did 3 of them, and each one had a different logic and different timing and different but I think all this research and all these things, putting an emphasis on the idea that the art world, and I specifically say art world, of course, you can enlarge it and say also the theoretical world, the academic world, or other worlds. But there's a moment now that we have to look at ourselves and kind of have to kind of practice audiencemanship, I don't know how to call that, within within our communities, you know. And I think that's a major reaction to neoliberalism, of course, and the way that it kind of eats everything and kind of, yeah, puts you in those kind of questions, or these junctions of like choosing and stuff. But it's always kind of like a facade in a way, and I think it's about practicing, like I said in the beginning, a certain fidelity to what it is to be an artist, what it is to be a performance artist, what it is to be an academic, or what it is to be, you know, like a doctor, whatever. There's a Hippocratic moment for the audiences now, I think, because it's so, and I think also thinking of conservation in that sense becomes different, because I think because you have to kind of maybe it's about more of like conserving knowledge now with the audiences, and that cannot be a quantitative thing. It cannot be yeah, we live in such populist times, and everything is immediately, you know, being canceled out as elitist, privileged, or whatever. I actually have this concept which I call it the mythos of privilogos, you know, and it's like I think we're so thinking in terms of privileges in our culture. But what is a privilogos? You know, something that like a word, or like, so thinking in terms of performance is like giving a extended status, like a privy to the logos, to the world, but only if you remember that it's a part of a mythos. You know, only if you just do privilogoses, it's like what capitalism does. You know, it's what you just promote your word, you conserve your word, you accumulate it, you create canons, you give, and then it creates problems of privileges. But if the privilogos is subsumed in the mythos, you know, in the mythos of art, or the mythos of humanity, even, you know, and then you are recruited. You are recruited in a different way. Maybe again, if I hear the Benjamin influences in my in my talk, you know, because I think, like I said about the museum and conservation, the dancer can go in and out of the museum, but in a way they cannot go in and out of the mythos. You know, even when the dancer was on stage and she had this kind of how do you say moment of revelation of not of equality, of how do you say whatever, I will remember the word, but let's say equality. And she went down the stage and she went to the street and she met Trisha Brown, and they performed in the public, and then they went together in the museum and they did an event at the museum, and they went out again, and now they're asking where to go, kind of, you know. But through that thing, the mythos, you couldn't escape, you know, the mythos of what happened to humanity in that process. And for me, the pandemic was another moment like that, it was a very important performative moment, because we could sense it. It was not just a conceptual imaginative process. It was something that everything was performed differently, and in that sense it was like I call it a general rehearsal. You know, it's like it's a repetition. It's an embodied repetition.